Picture this: a young aristocrat, barely in his 20s, standing on a hill in Rome, tears streaming down his face as he makes an oath that will change the fate of an entire continent. He swears on his knees that he will not rest until he breaks the chains of Spanish colonial rule that have enslaved South America for 3 centuries. His name is Simón Bolívar, and this is the story of how one man's impossible dream liberated 6 nations and earned him the title El Libertador. But here's what makes this story truly gripping. Bolívar wasn't supposed to be a revolutionary hero. He was born into wealth and privilege, destined for a comfortable life of luxury. He could have spent his days enjoying his family's vast fortune, but instead, he chose a path that would lead him through unimaginable betrayals, devastating losses, passionate love affairs, and battles that seemed impossible to win. By the time his journey ended, he had freed more territory than any military leader in history. Yet he would die alone, penniless, and believing himself a failure. How does a privileged aristocrat become a revolutionary? What drives a man to sacrifice everything for an ideal? And why, after achieving the impossible, did Bolívar die thinking he had accomplished nothing? Stay with me, because this story has more plot twists than any Hollywood blockbuster. Let's start at the beginning. Simón José Antonio de la Santísima Trinidad Bolívar y Palacios was born on July 24th, 1783, in Caracas, Venezuela, into one of the wealthiest families in South America. We're talking serious money here. His family owned copper mines, plantations, and thousands of enslaved people. Young Simón was basically the equivalent of being born into a billionaire family today. But wealth couldn't protect him from tragedy. By the age of 9, both of his parents were dead. His father died when he was just 3, and his mother followed 6 years later. Orphan and alone, young Simón was passed between relatives, each guardian struggling to control this wild, energetic child who seemed allergic to authority. Here's where the story gets interesting. Enter Simón Rodriguez, a tutor who would change everything. Rodriguez wasn't your typical colonial-era teacher drilling Latin and Catholic doctrine. No, this man was a radical philosopher who filled young Bolívar's head with dangerous ideas. Rousseau, Voltaire, the Enlightenment, and a revolutionary notion that people had natural rights that no king could take away. Imagine being a teenager in the 1790s, hearing about the American and French revolutions while living under Spanish colonial rule. It was intoxicating. At 16, following Spanish-American tradition, Bolívar was sent to Spain to complete his education and hopefully settle down. But Spain in 1799 was a gilded cage, and Bolívar was more interested in philosophy and fencing than courtly manners. Then came the moment that would soften his revolutionary fire, at least temporarily. He met Maria Teresa Rodriguez del Toro y Aleza. Love hit Bolívar like a thunderbolt. Maria Teresa was beautiful, intelligent, and from a respectable Spanish family. Despite her family's initial resistance to this passionate young man from the colonies, Bolívar persisted. They married in 1802 when he was just 19, and he took his bride back to Venezuela, imagining a life of domestic bliss on his family estates. But fate had other plans. Within 8 months of their arrival in Venezuela, Maria Teresa contracted yellow fever and died in Bolívar's arms. He was devastated, absolutely shattered. Later in life, Bolívar would say something profound. If I had not been widowed, perhaps my life would have been different. I would not be General Bolívar or El Libertador. Think about that for a moment. The death of his young wife freed him from domestic obligations and left him with nothing to lose. Grief-stricken and directionless, Bolívar returned to Europe in 1804, determined never to marry again. And it was during the second European journey that the revolutionary was truly born. Bolívar arrived in Europe at the most exciting historical moment imaginable. Napoleon Bonaparte was crowning himself Emperor of France, turning the French Republic into an empire. The young Venezuelan, along with his old tutor Simón Rodriguez and a friend named Fernando del Toro, watched in disgust as Napoleon placed the crown on his own head. Bolívar was furious. Here was the man who had supposedly championed the rights of man, liberty, equality, and fraternity, now declaring himself emperor. The hypocrisy was staggering. It crystallized something in Bolívar's mind. South America didn't need a new king or emperor. It needed true liberation, true republicanism. On August 15th, 1805, standing on Monte Sacro, the sacred mount, overlooking Rome, Bolivar made his famous oath. With his hand raised to heaven, he swore, "I swear before you, I swear by the God of my fathers, I swear by my fathers, I swear by my honor, and I swear by my homeland, that I will not rest body or soul until I have broken the chains that bind us to Spain." This wasn't just dramatic posturing. This was a 22-year-old man committing his entire life, his fortune, and his sacred honor to an impossible goal. Spain had ruled South America for 300 years. The Spanish Empire was one of the most powerful forces on earth, and this one young man, with no military training, was swearing to bring it all down. When Bolivar returned to Venezuela in 1807, the colonial world was already cracking. Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808 created a power vacuum that South American colonies began to exploit. If Spain's king was Napoleon's prisoner, who exactly ruled the colonies? This question opened the door to revolution. But here's what most people don't know. Bolivar's first attempt at revolution was an absolute disaster. When Venezuela declared independence in 1811, he was just one officer among many. The young republic was poorly organized, divided by internal conflicts, and facing a massive Spanish counteroffensive. Then nature itself seemed to turn against them. On March 26, 1812, a catastrophic earthquake struck Venezuela, killing tens of thousands of people, many of them while attending church services for Holy Thursday. Spanish priests immediately declared this was God's judgment on the rebels. The psychological impact was devastating. Many Venezuelans who had supported independence began to think maybe God really was on Spain's side. The first republic collapsed within months. Bolivar had to flee, and it was during this chaotic retreat that he made one of his most controversial decisions. His commanding officer, Francisco de Miranda, the older revolutionary who had fought in 3 revolutions across 2 continents, was planning to negotiate with the Spanish. Bolivar and other officers, believing Miranda was betraying the cause, arrested him and turned him over to the Spanish, who imprisoned him until his death. This decision would haunt Bolivar for the rest of his life. Was it a necessary act to save the revolution, or did he betray the very father of South American independence? We'll never know for certain, but it shows you the kind of impossible moral choices Bolivar faced, and the story was just beginning. After the collapse of the First Republic, most people would have given up. Bolivar had lost everything. He was in exile in Colombia, and the Spanish seemed invincible. But here's where you see the real character of the man. Instead of surrendering, Bolivar began planning his comeback. In 1813, he launched what would become known as the Campana Admirable, the Admirable Campaign. Starting from Colombia with a tiny army of barely 800 men, Bolivar began one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. His strategy was simple but brilliant. Move fast, strike hard, and don't give the enemy time to organize. Bolivar's army swept through the Andes like a hurricane. Battle after battle, his forces defeated larger Spanish armies through speed, surprise, and sheer audacity. His soldiers marched through territories most people considered impassable. They climbed mountains, forded rivers, and endured conditions that would break most armies. On June 15, 1813, Bolivar issued a decree of war to the death. This document is chilling and controversial even today. Bolivar declared that any Spaniard who did not actively support independence would be executed, while any American who supported the Spanish cause would be pardoned if they switched sides. It was psychological warfare designed to fracture Spanish support, but also escalated the conflict into total war. By August 1813, Bolivar triumphantly entered Caracas. The crowds went wild. They literally gave him the title Liberator, right there in the streets. At 30 years old, Bolivar had achieved the impossible. The Second Republic of Venezuela was born, and Bolivar was its hero. But here's the brutal truth about revolution. Victory is often temporary. A Spanish-born officer named José Tomás Bose had organized an army of llaneros, the tough cowboys of the Venezuelan plains. Bose was a fascinating and terrifying figure. Charismatic, brilliant, and absolutely ruthless. He promised the llaneros that they could keep whatever they plundered from the wealthy Creole aristocrats. Class warfare emerged with the independence struggle, creating a nightmare scenario. Bolivar's forces were devastating. They didn't just defeat armies. They massacred civilians, destroyed towns, and spread terror across Venezuela. Bolivar's Second Republic began to crumble under the assault. By 1814, Bolivar was forced to evacuate Caracas, leading a desperate retreat of thousands of refugees across Venezuela in what became known as the emigration to the east. Picture this scene. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children fleeing for their lives, pursued by Bolivar's cavalry. Many died of disease, starvation, or Spanish bullets. Bolivar tried to protect them, but his forces were overwhelmed. By the end of 1814, the Second Republic had fallen, and Bolivar was once again in exile. Most historians would tell you this was Bolivar's lowest point. He had failed twice. His reputation was in tatters. Many people blamed him for the disasters. Some of his fellow revolutionaries thought he was too ambitious, too reckless, too authoritarian. Bolivar himself fell into a deep depression, questioning whether independence was even possible. In 1815, Bolivar did something unexpected. He wrote, while in exile in Jamaica, poor and seemingly defeated, Bolivar penned one of the most important documents in Latin American history, the Jamaica Letter. This wasn't just a letter. It was a manifesto, a prophecy, and a blueprint for South American independence. In the Jamaica Letter, Bolivar analyzed why the revolutions had failed and what needed to change. He predicted the future of South American nations with eerie accuracy, foresaw the challenges they would face, and articulated a vision of continental unity that still resonates today. He wrote about how South American republics should be structured, warned against imitating European or North American models without adaptation, and insisted that South Americans had to forge their own path. But writing letters doesn't win wars. Bolivar needed soldiers, weapons, and money. He found an unexpected ally in Haiti. Alexander Pétion, the president of Haiti, gave Bolivar something invaluable: support without strings attached. Pétion provided weapons, soldiers, ships, and supplies for Bolivar's expeditions. His only condition? That Bolivar must free the enslaved people in the territories he liberated. This moment is crucial. Bolivar himself was born into a slave-owning family, but his revolutionary ideals were pushing him toward abolition. Pétion's condition aligned with Bolivar's growing belief that true liberty meant liberty for everyone. It wouldn't be easy. Many of his wealthy supporters owned slaves, but Bolivar committed to the cause. In 1816, Bolivar launched his third attempt to liberate Venezuela. This time, he was smarter, more patient, and more strategic. He established a base in the Orinoco River region, an area that was difficult for Spanish forces to reach. From this base, he began building a real army, establishing a functioning government, and even starting a newspaper to spread revolutionary ideas. This is where Bolivar showed his political genius. He convened the Congress of Angostura in 1819, creating a constitutional framework for the republic he was still fighting to establish. In his address to the Congress, Bolivar laid out his vision: a strong executive to provide stability, a hereditary Senate to provide continuity, an electoral system to ensure representation, and moral education to create virtuous citizens. But Bolivar knew that speeches and constitutions wouldn't win the war. He needed a military masterstroke. And that's exactly what he delivered. Picture the Andes Mountains in 1819, towering peaks, freezing temperatures, and terrain so harsh that no army had ever crossed them during the rainy season. The Spanish controlled all the major routes in Venezuela, so conventional military strategy said Bolivar should wait, regroup, and attack when conditions improved. Bolivar looked at the impossible and said, "Let's do that." In May 1819, Bolivar announced he was taking his army across the Andes to liberate New Granada, modern-day Colombia. His officers thought he was insane. The route he proposed crossed flooded plains, then climbed through freezing mountain passes at over 13,000 feet. Most of his soldiers were from the hot lowlands and had never seen snow. He had cavalry units, but no way to get horses over the mountains. They did it anyway. For over a month, Bolivar's army of about 2,500 men endured hell. Soldiers marched through chest-deep water in the flooded plains, their feet developing infections that would cripple many. Then they climbed into the freezing Paramo, the high-altitude ecosystem where temperatures plunged below freezing at night. Hundreds died. They lost most of their horses. Soldiers had to eat them to survive. Many men suffered from hypothermia and altitude sickness. But they kept moving because Bolívar moved with them, sharing every hardship, refusing any special comfort. When they finally descended on the Spanish in Colombia, the enemy was completely unprepared. On August 7th, 1819, at the Battle of Boyaca, Bolívar's exhausted but determined army defeated the Spanish royalist forces. The victory was decisive. Within days, Bolívar entered Bogotá as a liberator. New Granada was free. This victory changed everything. Bolívar now controlled two territories, Venezuela and New Granada. In December 1819, he proclaimed the creation of Gran Colombia, a new nation that united Venezuela, New Granada, and eventually Ecuador. It was Bolívar's dream of unity beginning to take shape. But the war wasn't over. Spain still held significant territory, including most of Venezuela and all of Ecuador. And the biggest challenge still lay ahead. Peru, the heartland of Spanish power in South America, where the Spanish had concentrated their best troops and their most loyal supporters. Before we continue with the military campaigns, we need to talk about Manuela Sáenz, because she's absolutely central to understanding Bolívar's later life. If you've heard of her at all, you might know her as Bolívar's mistress, but that description doesn't begin to capture who she was or what she meant to him. Manuela was born in Ecuador, the illegitimate daughter of a Spanish nobleman. In the rigid social hierarchy of colonial South America, this illegitimacy marked her for life. She was brilliant, passionate, and unconventional. She learned to ride and fence, skills considered scandalous for women of her era. She was also trapped in a loveless arranged marriage to a wealthy English merchant named James Thorne. When Bolívar arrived in Ecuador in 1822, he was at the height of his power and fame. Manuela was volunteering with the independence forces, helping however she could. They met at a ball, and the attraction was immediate and intense. Within weeks, they were lovers, and Manuela had made a decision. She was leaving her husband to follow Bolívar. This wasn't a casual affair. Manuela became Bolívar's partner in every sense, his confidant, his political advisor, and quite literally his bodyguard. She rode with him on campaigns, handled his correspondence, and gathered intelligence. She dressed in military uniform and carried weapons. High society was scandalized. Bolívar's enemies called her every name you can imagine, but Bolívar loved her completely. The most famous story about Manuela happened in 1828, during an assassination attempt on Bolívar in Bogotá. Conspirators broke into the palace where Bolívar was sleeping, intending to kill him. Manuela confronted them, arguing with them and delaying them while Bolívar escaped through a window in his nightshirt. She literally saved his life. After that night, Bolívar called her Libertadora del Libertador, the liberator of the liberator. Their relationship was complicated, passionate, and sometimes stormy. They fought, they reconciled, they pushed each other. But through all the political chaos and military campaigns that would follow, Manuela remained Bolívar's anchor. When he died, she could preserve his letters and papers, fighting to protect his legacy even as she lived in poverty and exile. While Bolívar was liberating the North, another legendary revolutionary was working from the South, José de San Martín. San Martín had freed Argentina and Chile and was pushing into Peru, but he was struggling against strong Spanish resistance and internal political problems. In July 1822, these two giants of South American independence met face-to-face in Guayaquil, Ecuador. This meeting has become one of history's great mysteries because no one knows exactly what they discussed. They met privately, without witnesses, for several hours. What we do know is what happened afterward. San Martín withdrew from Peru and eventually went into exile in Europe, leaving the field to Bolívar. Why? Some historians think San Martín recognized that Bolívar's political ambitions were incompatible with his own more modest goals. Others believe San Martín was exhausted and saw Bolívar as better equipped to finish the job. Still others think Bolívar simply outmaneuvered him politically. Whatever happened in that room, Bolívar now had a clear path to Peru, the ultimate prize. Peru was the richest Spanish possession in South America, the center of viceregal power, and home to the strongest Spanish military presence on the continent. If Bolívar could take Peru, Spanish rule in South America would effectively be over. The Peruvian campaign was incredibly complex. Bolívar wasn't just fighting the Spanish. He was navigating treacherous political waters with Peruvian factions, dealing with suspicious Argentine and Chilean forces, and managing the internal politics of Gran Colombia from thousands of miles away. In 1824, everything came to a head. On August 6th, at the Battle of Junín, Bolívar achieved a stunning cavalry victory without firing a single shot. The entire battle was fought with lances and sabers. Then, on December 9th, 1824, at the Battle of Ayacucho, Bolívar's most trusted general, Antonio José de Sucre, commanded the decisive victory that effectively ended Spanish power in South America. Ayacucho was extraordinary. Sucre's forces were outnumbered, fighting at high altitude, facing Spain's best troops and commanders. They won decisively. The Spanish viceroy himself was captured. It was over. After 300 years of colonial rule and 15 years of revolutionary war, South America was finally truly free. Bolívar stood at the absolute peak of his power. He was the liberator of 6 nations: Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Panama. He controlled more territory than any military leader since Napoleon. European observers compared him to Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. The Peruvian Congress offered to make him dictator for life. He seemed invincible. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn, because the great liberator was about to watch his dream crumble. Success in war doesn't guarantee success in peace. Bolívar discovered this truth in the most painful way possible. The vast territory he had liberated was almost impossible to govern as a single nation. Gran Colombia stretched from Panama to the borders of Brazil, different climates, different economies, different regional interests. The only thing holding it together was Bolívar himself. And Bolívar was exhausted. Years of campaigning had destroyed his health. He suffered from tuberculosis, recurring fevers, chronic pain, and what we would probably now recognize as severe PTSD. He was losing weight, coughing blood, and aging rapidly. The man who had crossed the Andes now struggled to mount a horse. Worse, he was losing the political battles. The very people he had liberated were turning against him. Why? Because Bolívar's vision of how South American republics should work was fundamentally at odds with what many revolutionaries wanted. Bolívar believed that South American nations needed strong central governments to prevent chaos. He advocated for lifetime presidencies with significant executive power, arguing that South American societies weren't ready for radical democracy. Many of his former allies saw this as betrayal. They hadn't fought to replace one dictator with another, even a benevolent one. The situation grew toxic. Bolívar's enemies called him a would-be tyrant, comparing him to Napoleon. His friends were assassinated or turned against him. Regional leaders began agitating for independence from Gran Colombia. Venezuela wanted to break away. Ecuador wanted out. Even in Colombia, where he had been loved, people were turning against him. In 1828, there was a serious assassination attempt on Bolívar in Bogotá, the one where Manuela saved his life. Afterward, Bolívar said something revealing. "These people don't want me. I have plowed the sea." The sadness in that statement is heartbreaking. The man who had sacrificed everything was beginning to believe it was all for nothing. By 1829, Venezuela had officially seceded from Gran Colombia. Ecuador would follow shortly. The unified South American nation Bolívar had dreamed of was disintegrating. He tried everything: constitutional conventions, political compromises, personal appeals, but nothing worked. In 1830, Bolívar did something that shocked everyone. He resigned. Sick, defeated, and heartbroken, he announced he was leaving public life and going into exile in Europe. He hoped that his departure might allow peace and reconciliation. As he prepared to leave, he wrote to a friend, "America is ungovernable. Those who serve the revolution plow the sea." Bolívar's final journey is one of the most tragic endings in all of history. Sick with tuberculosis, nearly penniless. He had spent his entire personal fortune on the revolution, and politically isolated, he set out from Bogotá in May 1830, intending to reach the coast and sail to Europe. He never made it. His health deteriorated rapidly. His lungs were failing. He could barely eat, and he was in constant pain. A Spanish friend, Joaquin de Meyer, offered him refuge at his estate, San Pedro Alejandrino, near Santa Marta on the Caribbean coast. Bolívar spent his final days in a small room in this borrowed house. The great liberator, who had once commanded armies and ruled nations, was attended by just a handful of loyal friends. His physician documented his physical decline, which was rapid and terrible. Bolívar was just 47 years old, but looked ancient. On his deathbed, Bolívar dictated his final proclamation to the people of Colombia. It's a heartbreaking document. He urged peace, reconciliation, and obedience to the law. He asked his enemies to forgive him. He begged his followers to maintain unity, and he admitted, in effect, that his great dream had failed. Simón Bolívar died on December 17, 1830 at 1 p.m. He was so poor that he was buried in a borrowed shirt. The man who had liberated an entire continent died, thinking he had accomplished nothing. He famously said shortly before his death, "There have been 3 great fools in history, Jesus Christ, Don Quixote, and me." But here's what Bolívar didn't live to see. Within years, his reputation began to recover. Within decades, he was recognized as a hero again. Today, every South American nation he helped liberate honors him. Venezuela's currency is named after him. Cities, towns, parks, and institutions across Latin America bear his name. Bolivia is literally named after him. Most importantly, his ideas, flawed as they may have been in practice, about South American unity, about resistance to colonialism, about the dignity and rights of people to govern themselves, these ideas lived on. They influenced every subsequent movement for independence, sovereignty, and justice in Latin America. So what do we make of Simón Bolívar? Was he a liberator or a would-be dictator? A visionary or a dreamer whose dreams exceeded reality? The answer, like most historical truth, is complicated. Bolívar freed 6 nations from colonial rule. That's a fact. He led armies through impossible terrain and won battles he shouldn't have won. He articulated a vision of South American unity and independence that inspired generations. He pushed for the abolition of slavery, for indigenous rights, and for equality before the law in societies that had never known these things. But he also made serious mistakes. His authoritarian tendencies alienated allies and gave ammunition to enemies. His dream of a unified South America may have been impossible from the start, not because the dream was wrong, but because the political, economic, and social realities of the region couldn't support it. His faith in strong executive power, while perhaps necessary for military victory, made building sustainable democratic institutions much harder. Here's what fascinates me most about Bolívar. He changed his mind. Over his life, he evolved, learned from mistakes, and adapted his thinking. The young aristocrat who made an oath on Monte Sacro wasn't the same man who fought his way across the continent, who wasn't the same man who tried to govern Gran Colombia, who wasn't the same man who died in Santa Marta. He grew, he learned, and yes, he failed. But he failed spectacularly while attempting something impossible. Think about what Bolívar accomplished against absurd odds. He defeated the Spanish Empire, one of the most powerful forces on earth. He freed more territory than any military leader in history, except perhaps Alexander the Great. He did this without the resources, training, or support that most military commanders take for granted. He did it while sick, while mourning personal losses, while betrayed by friends and attacked by enemies. And yet he died believing he had accomplished nothing. Why? Because his greatest dream, a unified, free South America, seemed to have died before him. But was he really a failure? Consider this. Today, every country Bolívar helped liberate is an independent nation. None of them are colonies anymore. The Spanish Empire that ruled for 300 years is gone and will never return. Ideas about human rights, self-determination, and republican government that seemed radical in 1810 are now fundamental principles in every South American nation. Bolívar didn't just win battles. He changed what was possible. He proved that seemingly invincible empires could be challenged and defeated. He demonstrated that South Americans could govern themselves. He articulated dreams that others would pursue long after his death. So here's my final question for you, and I really want you to think about this. What does it mean to succeed? Bolivar achieved things no one thought possible, yet died thinking he had failed. He liberated millions, yet couldn't create the unified nation he envisioned. He's remembered as a hero, though he considered himself a fool. In our own lives, how often do we judge ourselves by impossible standards? How often do we achieve extraordinary things, but focus only on what we didn't accomplish? Bolivar's story reminds us that history takes the long view. What seems like failure in the moment might actually be the foundation for future success. What appears to be an ending might actually be a beginning. So here's what I want you to consider. If you could ask Simón Bolívar one question, knowing everything you know now about how his legacy turned out, what would you ask him? Would you ask about his military strategies, his romantic relationships, his political philosophy? Or would you simply ask, if you could see your legacy now, would you still believe you plowed the sea? Drop your answers in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what resonates with you about Bolivar's story. And if you found this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating figures valuable, if you enjoyed exploring the complicated, messy, inspiring truth about a man who literally changed the world, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week, we dive deep into the lives of extraordinary people, the ones whose stories are too complex, too nuanced, and too important for simple hero worship or easy dismissal. We're building a community of people who love history not as a collection of dates and facts, but as a way to understand ourselves, our world, and what humans are capable of achieving against impossible odds. Until next time, remember, the greatest achievements often look like failures before they become legends. Maybe that's not a reason for despair. Maybe that's a reason for hope. See you next time